Welcome, brothers and sisters from Westside. We're continuing our study of Genesis 12 through 50 about the patriarchs. We, of course, are in the story of Joseph. Joseph has just risen to power in chapters 40 and 41. He was imprisoned, remember, because of what happened with Potiphar's wife unjustly. He was imprisoned. But he finds there the two chief officers, the baker and the cupbearer to Pharaoh. He interprets their dreams. He's forgotten by the cupbearer for a couple of years after the cupbearer's release, but then Pharaoh dreams. And that, of course, is all set up by God. And all these long years of Joseph being in Egypt now come to fruition with him coming to power in Egypt. And so that is the story of Joseph. Was one of the great stories in the Bible, of course, about uh, who Joseph was and what he did for the people. But at the end, it's not, of course, the story about men, but it is the glory and the divine sovereignty of God that controlled all of these events and brought them to pass. All right, so last week we were showing the map of Egypt. Again, here it is with the inset, so you can see the entire Egypt laid out. This is called Lower Egypt, and it's kind of the opposite of how we would think. The north seems to be, it ought to be Upper Egypt is the north end where the river runs into the Mediterranean, but that, of course, would be Lower Egypt. Geographically speaking, the water would run out to the Nile, and then it begins at its headwaters much deeper into the African subcontinent. And there are two ruling places. The one that's in Lower Egypt is at the big part of the map, Memphis, there at the bottom of your map center on the Nile River. Of course, very famous place in archaeology. And then further down, way down, if you look at the inset, would be Thebes. Almost to the bottom of the inset would be Thebes. And that was the second ruling place in Egypt of the pharaohs. So you had Upper and Lower Egypt that were united at some point. Another thing I'd point out on the map is just above where it says Memphis Great Pyramid, you see On. Remember that Joseph, when he rose to power, Pharaoh gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On. And so that would have been a very significant man in the ranking of how priests were looked at in Egyptian. They were powerful people, had many lands and wealth and all of that because of the Egyptian beliefs in their gods. And so that's kind of gives you an idea of that general area. So we come now, of course, to the story in chapter 42 where Joseph's brothers will meet him for the first time. So in verses 1 and 2, it begins with when Jacob learned there was grain for sale in Egypt. Literally, the word learn should be translated saw. That's what exactly how Jacob saw. Now, he didn't go down there and see, but as we often say, we see, we understand something, we've comprehended it. And it contrasts nicely with the next phrase that says, when he looked at the brothers of Joseph, or Jacob's sons, why do you look at one another? They're all sitting around dazed, not knowing what to do. And Jacob takes the lead. He saw that there was grain for sale in Egypt. So he sends his brothers, Joseph's brothers, and it shifts from Jacob's sons to Joseph's brothers in verses 3 and 4. 10 of them, remember, Joseph is down in Egypt, so 10 of them are left. Benjamin will not go, and that plays into the story. He's the youngest of the favored wife, Rachel, youngest son of Jacob, who's an old man. And he obviously is very favored, which, of course, we also recognize in the story as it plays out. So when the brothers come, then we are told at verse 6 Joseph was overseer of the land and that he sold to all the people of the land. Joseph's brothers come then and bow down before him. Now, Joseph probably didn't sell to every last person that came to the land, but those that came from outside of Egypt, that would be particularly cause for concern because among them could be spies, as he will later accuse his brothers of being. I mean, if you had all the wealth and the grain, that'd be prime want to attack Egypt if there were powerful coalition of forces. And so Joseph is taking obviously as the prime minister, the key one to Pharaoh himself is taking uh, uh, personal concern in and overseeing the selling of that grain to those that are outside the land. When Joseph's brothers come and bow before him, it contrasts with, you remember years before, and they saw him approaching in his many-colored robe. They said, let's kill Joseph, when they envied him. And then they said, what becomes of his dreams? And unknowing to them, they are fulfilling them. They are bowing down before Joseph just as his dreams had predicted. In fact, 42 and verse 9, it says Joseph remembered the dreams, how the sheaves of his brothers bowed down to his sheaf, and how the sun, moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to Joseph. And so Joseph is now fulfilling that. God is fulfilling it in the life of Joseph. And so Joseph saw his brothers, and they did not recognize him. We'll talk about that in a minute. So he treats them like strangers, speaks to them roughly. Could have been initially out of his anger at seeing them, all of a sudden the shock of having the men that had wronged him so those 22 long years ago. But also, I think he is setting up. It could be that deliberately he's treating them that way and not just reacting because he needs to find out information. And so he's got to go about a process of finding that out. Verse 8 says that they do not recognize him, but he recognizes them. So we might ask, well, why didn't they recognize him? Well, first of all, they had sold him into slavery. I mean, who could have even begun to think that he could have risen to the powerful place that he was in Egypt in those 22 years since the last time they had seen him? I mean, it just wouldn't. He's not even in the place they would expect him to be. The second thing is he's in Egyptian dress, as the picture even shows here. He's clean shaven, which is most likely accurate. The Egyptians were clean shaven for the most part. And that the Semitic men, as you see in the picture, would have all worn beards, which would have been very common for Canaanites and the Semitic peoples who the Hebrews were to wear beards. This particular picture has a clean-shaven young one, boy, and of course that later when they bring Benjamin. But nonetheless, this picture accurately, I think, depicts why, again, they wouldn't have recognized him for the kind of differences in their dress and how he was depicted. And we might ask, men, do you change from 17 years old to 22 years later at 39? I bet some of you, your hair is not as thick and you may be a little pudgier than you were at 17. I mean, you wouldn't expect somebody to necessarily look the same. And thirdly, he spoke through an interpreter. He's speaking Egyptian. And so an interpreter is speaking for him to them. And so they wouldn't even begin, they would have more focused in on the interpreter and probably not wanted to look at Joseph that much because of the augustness of him being such a powerful position. And so he accuses them then of being spies. Part of that remembering that it says he did, Joseph had tried to forget. Verse 9 says that Joseph remembered. Manasseh remembers what he named the gods that made me forget, but now he must remember. There they are right before him. And he knows the dreams, and that, as we've already talked about. And so to get them to talk, he begins to accuse them of being spies, and he must get them to talk. He needs to find out if Benjamin is even alive. I mean, they may have taken out their wrath on Benjamin, because you can imagine that Jacob, would have treated now Benjamin in the same honored place that he had treated Joseph, and that the sons could have grown just as jealous of Benjamin, and they may have killed him in the meanwhile. He needs to find out if his father's alive. If he asks two revealing questions, then they'll know who he is, and he can't do that. So he needs to get them to talk. And by accusing them of being spies, what's the end for spies? You're put to death. Shot before a firing squad, or in this day hung, as the baker was, and so and impaled on a tree after that. So you can imagine that he needs to get them to ask. So talk. So they begin to talk. They said in verses 10 and 11, we have come to buy food because of the famine, and that's true. We're all the sons of one man, and that's true. We're all honest men. You can imagine Joseph laughing under his breath. They've lied for the last 22 years with their father Jacob that Joseph was killed by wild beasts. They go on to say at verse 13, we are 12 brothers, sons of one man in Canaan, which is true. The youngest is with our father, which is true. And one is no more. Think of the irony. They're facing Joseph and telling him, Joseph is dead, when, of course, Joseph is very much alive. And so Joseph begins then to deal with them by saying that they will be tested. and that is that they must go back and bring Benjamin. So he's going to throw them into the slammer for 3 days and let them cook and think about how serious the situation is. Treat them roughly in that way, and then bring them out. They get a taste of their own medicine of where he has been for the last several years before he rose to power. And he modifies the plan. He says, if you are honest men, only one of you is going to remain in jail. One brother will be thrown in jail, and the rest will return to Canaan. And when you come back, you better bring Benjamin with you. And by that I will know your other brother with you. By that I will know that you are honest men. If you are honest men, and they will become much more that as we see as the story unfolds. But he's also setting a plan for Simeon. Simeon is going to be the one that he seizes, and we need to realize that he's putting Simeon in a place that he was in. Will these brothers just leave him there to rot, or will they find grain some other way, pay a hefty price for somebody bringing it out, and they won't have to go back, pay double for it for somebody that'll go down to Egypt for them? Will they just leave Simeon there to rot, or will these be honest men? Will they come back and deal with it? And then an amazing thing happens. In verses 21 and 22, the brothers confess. And oh, do they confess? Read verse 21 with me. Then they said to one another, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, and that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. This is why this distress has come upon us. And Reuben answered them, did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood. I want you to think about, they had borne that guilt for 22 years. There must have been other times that they talked about it, and it had come up, and now it comes up. And they do not know that this one that they cannot even begin to fathom is Joseph, the brother they sold into slavery, is listening to them, much like God listens in on our thoughts, on our speaking to ourselves. And here's exactly what we are saying. And then they accuse themselves rightly and say, judgment has fallen upon us. This is why this distress has come upon us. And we are to reckon our blood guilt this day, Reuben says. Remember, Reuben didn't know about what the brothers had done. He had convinced them to put him in the pit, and somehow goes away for some reason. Judah's the one that then sees the Ishmaelite, and they concoct the plan to sell him. When Reuben comes back, he's not there. Did they not tell him? I think probably they did tell him. He does know what has happened, but a reckoning for blood, kidnapping was a capital offense in Exodus. Later, chapter 21 and verse 16, it is a capital offense to kidnap someone, and it would have been a capital offense in the day that they are in. So judgment has come upon them. And at that, it tells us in verse 24 that Joseph turned away and went from them and wept. And it's not going to be the last time that we see this in the story. In other words, Joseph begins to realize that they indeed have the ability to repent and the hope for reconciliation. Folks, we can have a forgiving spirit towards someone, but until they repent, until they change their ways, until they acknowledge their sin and ask for forgiveness, there cannot be reconciliation. No coming together of two divided parties can happen unless there is that asking for forgiveness and changing of ways. And if indeed recompense needs to be paid, then it must be paid for the crime that has been committed. And so they have set up that test for Simeon. Why did he take Simeon? Only we can reckon that he heard what Reuben said. Reuben's the oldest, and so he doesn't take the oldest. Remember, he's going to set them in order later at a table according to their chronological birth, and they're going to think he can divine that. Somehow he knows that by the gods. How could he do that if just guess it accurately? And they still don't know he's Joseph. He takes Simeon, who is the second oldest, but it also could be because Simeon had a violent past. Remember what he and his brother Levi did to Shechem and to that city, and how that probably his cruelty came out that day, that maybe he was the ringleader, and how cruelly they stripped the robe off Joseph, threw him in the pit, and then sold him into the sat down and ate and didn't even listen to his cries. Reuben said he was crying out to us, and they just ate like nothing was going on. And so Simeon could have been the one that was the ringleader of that violent and treated Joseph the worst, and so that's why he's chosen. And so it tells us in verse 25 that Joseph commands his men to replace every man's money in his sack. And so he's setting a test. Can you imagine when they're going to discover that? Picture shows them filling some bags, but you can imagine they brought out some bags with their money in that had already been filled. Maybe they were all filled and then brought out to the men, and they loaded them and didn't check them until we are told that they got to the first night's lodging. And then they broke open a bag to feed one of their bags to feed the donkey, to feed his donkey. And they said to one another, "What is this that God has done to us?" You can only imagine the shock. And now they're going to find out all their money's been returned when they get back to their father. And we would refer to this as a retributive justice. That means that one gets what one deserves. Now, the Bible doesn't always teach retributive justice. There's suffering, for instance, because like Joseph, like Job, godly, good men, but they suffer for other reasons, for other causes. Satan is here. He brings bad things in the lives of people. Bad men are here. They bring bad things in it. God doesn't protect us from everything that happens to us. So because you suffer doesn't mean that, oh, God has done this and we are receiving payback for our sins. But in a very true way, that was true of these men. And the Bible teaches retributive justice. Whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. Even into the New Testament, Galatians 6, verse 7, it brings out that idea. So God does at times and will in the end of time give according to our deeds, according to what we have done, whether good or evil. And so their hearts failed them. You can only imagine that they believe that they are under the curse of God now. They are under his judgment, and only bad things can happen to them because of what they had done to Joseph. So when they come to the land, back to Canaan, they tell Jacob their father the intervening verses from 28 to 36, the story of what had happened. Jacob wants to know, why did you tell them everything? Well, he asked things, but he asked them in a way that they could not. They came forth with the information he needed. So Jacob says to them, Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and now you would take Benjamin from me. You will not. My son shall not go down with you. He is the only one left. And here, once again, we see the favoritism of Jacob to his last son, a special son of Rachel, his favorite wife. Once again, that terrible favoritism showing itself where not all of these sons, his sons, but he's the only one left. And again, we see Jacob committing the same thing he had done with Joseph, and the disaster that happened with Joseph could have easily have happened with Benjamin, but the brothers have changed. Time and what they know about God has changed them, and the story as it will move on will of course show that to be the case. So next week we'll begin with the second visit. The grain's going to run out. The famine's only in its second year. 5 years remain. The severity of it is they've got to go back and buy more grain so that their family can live. So thank you for paying attention, and we'll begin our study next week in Genesis 43.